Hey, welcome to the Business and Society podcast, where we explore the powerful role businesses play in shaping our societies. I'm your host, Senthil. Today, we are going to talk about market-based solutions for biodiversity. Joining me is Viraj Sikand, CEO of EarthAcre. Viraj is an entrepreneur, having experience bringing innovative sustainability ideas to market. He's an alumnus of Brown and currently in leave of absence from joint programs at Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Business School in order to launch and dedicate his efforts to EarthAcre. Viraj, such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Tell us your story. I was looking at your profile. You started a sustainable protein company, then you worked on circular economy, then you went to some of the finest schools in the world, and you got back to Kenya and started this work at EarthAcre. Tell us what led you to this path.
Yeah, so I guess my story begins in Kenya. So I grew up in Kenya, very much in an environmentalist household. So my family, my parents in particular, have been involved in conservation efforts for decades now. And so from an early age, I was exposed to the fact that most of the last remaining nature on Earth is actually outside of the national parks. It's on community lands, in particular indigenous communities. And yet these communities rarely access finance for this. And so there's this incredible paradox that nature, right, this complexity of life on Earth, this thing that is so rare, once you lose it, you never get it again. And yet today, is largely protected by those who are amongst the most marginalized. And this is true not just in Kenya, but actually at a global level. And so this has always been a very interesting thing for me, really seeing the power of community-based nature stewardship and just the fact that communities are largely undercompensated for that work. But as you correctly mentioned, I've spent my past 10 or so years in the United States working technology, always at the intersection of environment and tech. And so, started my first company about 10 years ago in circular economies, as you say, converting food waste into protein. Did that for a number of years and then joined a much larger company. This one had raised about $300 million around circular economies as well. It's called Optoro, recently got acquired. And just learned a ton about scaling up businesses at the intersection of environment and tech. And then, as you had alluded to, I was most recently at Harvard doing my graduate studies, where I met a professor who is among the world's leading experts at scalable measurements of nature. And so after I met him, I decided to focus on a new company and with some incredible co-founders as well, who I'm sure we can talk about at some point. And really the vision and the focus for EarthAcre is to combine technology with local knowledge so that we can make community lands investable, so that people can get paid to protect and restore nature. And really at the heart of this new model is our digital platform, which enables the onboarding of indigenous individual households, no matter the complexity and land tenure, community structure, effectively digitizing, organizing, formalizing smallholders and communities. And then we pair this with these incredible measurements of nature outcomes. And so then together, this platform can both optimize existing nature finance flows while enabling new revenues to go to communities through what we call nature assets, which I'm sure we'll talk more about.
Awesome. As we speak, I just opened your website. It says on the homepage, it says EarthAcre quantifies EarthAcre quantifies nature outcomes and enables direct cash payments to individual landowners. There's quite a bit of complexity there. Let's unpack a few things. How easy is to quantify nature, Viraj?
Yeah. So I guess it depends on how you want to do it. I guess the convention Senthil, or the sort of the predominant way that we have attempted to quantify complexity of life is by counting it, right? The different species. So people tend to do this in different ways. Maybe we go out and we count animals like one by one. Some people do it through apps. Some people do it through paper. Some people get on a helicopter or a plane and count. But it's different flavors of a similar thing. Some people use camera traps, digital observations, etc. And this is great. But it can be pretty costly, hard to scale, and difficult to compare. Like what you're counting on any given acre is going to be fundamentally different from the next acre, right? And so this professor who I referenced earlier, Professor Andrew Davies, a lot of his research, he's been measuring ecosystems across Africa, from South Africa, Congo, Rwanda, Kenya, everywhere, and both through his time at Harvard and previously at Stanford, just looking at the relationships between the way an ecosystem is structured and the biodiversity that can live within it, right? And so this can make intuitive sense, right? The more complex a landscape, the more complex the vegetative structure, the more niches. The more niches, the more insects. The more insects, the more birds, so on and so forth. If we boil it down to like a simple analogy, you can think of a studio apartment. It can only hold so many different kinds of people. For example, if you have a 4-bedroom apartment, now you can have a bunch of different kinds of people. You could have parents, kids, whatever. If you have a 200 room apartment building, for example, you can hold a lot more different complexity of kinds of people. People who like to party, whatever. People who are just family people. And so it's the same thing with what we look at as EarthAcre. We look at the capacity of the land to hold biodiversity, what we call biodiversity capacity. The nice thing about this is that we can get at structure through remote sensing. And so we've mapped down ecosystems to incredible precision and now do the same thing from satellite. You then build these predictive models of the capacity of that land to hold biodiversity, which we then can go audit through things like acoustic monitors, camera traps, surveys, that counting element. But you're actually doing the model first and the counting to audit versus the other way around.
Use this term called biodiversity capacity. Could you give some real-time example to make this concept comprehensive?
Yeah. So it starts off with taking these remote sensing. So we start off by building these relationships between ecosystem structure and species, right? So what that means is you take remote sensing based measurements of the land, and we've been able to map down some of our ecosystems to 1 centimeter resolution. That's every blade of grass, every leaf. And so from this, now we're able to build these models that predict the biodiversity that will live in this area using what's called a Shannon index. So it's a scientific metric that gives us an insight into what kind of biodiversity and the richness of that biodiversity that could plausibly exist within this structure. And we then go place acoustic monitors, camera traps. We've done hundreds of bird surveys to then go audit those models. And these now become generalizable models for a given ecoregion, is what it's called, like a grassland ecoregion.
So I'm taking a few examples from the carbon credit world. So one of the challenging thing here is ensuring additionality, right? And how do you make sure this additionality point is captured in biodiversity? Because, seasonal factors, you may see some species die down and regrow after 2 years, 3 years, or maybe even months. How do you ensure that anything you're protecting or regrowing is an additional thing and it's not something which is currently existing?
Yeah. So I think you're right to start this by sort of comparing this to the carbon markets. Let me actually take it back from a typical use case for how EarthAcre interacts with a given community. So really what happens, the first phase is, because as I mentioned earlier, the heart of our model is our digital platform. So first, communities use our platform. Once they get it in place, they're able to turn the nature on their land into an asset and get paid for it, right? So credits, offsets, these are definitely one way to do this. But with our platform, communities are able to access a number of different forms of nature finance. For example, outcomes-based financing, right? So if you take a given landscape, what we can do is we can take an initial analysis, right, in the way that we talked about using biodiversity capacity with a given outcomes funder to see, okay, do we want to sustain or restore this landscape? And so for sustain, for example, we can take these measurements using biodiversity capacity at time 0. And then well, a percentage of the money is released upfront. And this kicks off these interventions, like you're saying, potentially removing invasive species or reseeding grasses, and crucially, delivering direct payments to Indigenous landowners. We'll get at this to answer your additionality point. But these are all Indigenous-owned lands at high threat of conversion. We can talk more about this in a second when we get to that additionality component. But yeah, so a percentage of capital is released upfront, kicks off these interventions, and every year after that, you are able to rerun these biodiversity capacity measurements, which are scalable, which you can compare across acres, and which are rigorous. And payments only continue if that BCAP number, in the case of sustain, is sustained above a certain threshold that is predetermined, right? Taking into account stochastic variability, buffers, etc., right? In case there's a large drought that's outside of the landowner's control. And as I mentioned, a key intervention is payments to those Indigenous landowners, because often, right now, the status quo is that the tree is much more valuable dead than alive, or the elephant or whatever. And so people end up having to cut down the tree to put food on the table. Again, these are amongst the most marginalized people in the world today. They've been abdicated by capitalism and are having to work in a capitalist world, right? They need money to pay for school fees, etc. So how do you get them paid? And increasingly, conditional payments for nature outcomes is consistently considered amongst the most effective conservation strategies. And the challenge is it's just difficult to know who to pay, how much to pay, what's the outcome of that payment. And that's exactly what we're addressing. And of course, you can see how this now applies for Restore, where payments are triggered based on results as interventions are implemented to rehabilitate a site, right? Let's say removing invasives or bringing down fences. And so to bring it back to answer your question around additionality, right? Once a community has our platform in place, you can see exactly who owns the land, what's the payment history, what are the interventions implemented, what's the outcome of that work. So if you have a funder, you can see exactly how each dollar was spent, right? Which interventions were funded, and of course, the outcome, right, against a given target. And all of this is happening on community lands, which are amongst the most threatened in the world, right? These are not single title, already protected landscapes. It's very clear to see the acre value of these community areas against what the opportunity cost would be if a community member were to decide to, no longer continue with cultural practices such as like pastoralism in Maasai cultures in Kenya, and were instead to convert it into a mine or a quarry or something else. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. I have two follow-up questions on that. You operate in a region where land disputes or land titles has always been controversial, right? Do you face that challenge in the areas you operate, and how do you overcome that?
Absolutely. No, land tenure, and this sort of gets at a broader question around trust. How do you build trust in the system and verification, right? And so from a land ownership perspective, that is honestly one of the biggest issues that face nature-based solutions on community land, certainly in Kenya, certainly in Africa, probably across the world, right? And how do you handle all the complexity of land ownership that you find in landscapes such as this? And I can tell you, we just did payments even just a couple of weeks ago, and you have such complexity in terms of like, even if it's individually titled, right? And oftentimes there's no title, there's ancestral rights, or it's community titles, so 3,000 people owning one title. But sometimes the hardest is 3,000 people owning 3,000 different parcels of land. And even on that parcel of land, it's like 6 guys own one title, 2 of whom have a handshake. So again, you start to see how figuring out who to pay, how much to pay becomes very, very difficult. And as you move sophisticated capital through that, if you even have one payment going in the wrong direction, that can raise a grievance, and as you're saying, it is a big issue in conventional nature finance with communities today. It's why the convention is actually maybe just send the money to, yes, the community, but typically it's like 3 leaders at the top, and they decide, let's build maybe a school or a well or something like that, which can be good. But if you're an individual on the ground, you're not really benefiting. So how does our platform address this? The value of a platform is multi-tenancy, being able to request specific information from specific profiles. So let's say a community member, a developer, a project developer, a land surveyor. So you can request specific information, and now you can start to triangulate to match, verify, validate records. Our platform has whole flows, it has user flows that guide throughout this process. And so in doing so, you can now start to have proof points, and you can start to get at clean records. As you start to deliver payments, the nice thing is you're now organizing community structures and you're able to deliver direct payments. When you combine a platform with payments, direct payments, now you have ways to keep records up to date over time, right? Because individuals are incentivized to keep their records up to date in order to receive payments and to request information before a given payment. So this is how we're able to keep these records up to date over long time periods that are required for nature-based solutions.
Interesting. You used this word a few times called direct payments. When I was running through your website, that seems to be one of the key value add you're providing. Seems like a key differentiator, which working in the smallholder space, I understand how complex and yet how impactful it is. How do you do that among the communities where I assume, you got to correct me if I'm wrong, where bank account penetration or access to banking is only moderate, particularly keeping scalability in mind? You may be doing it now. Tomorrow, if you want to expand across the globe, what are your plans, or do you already have solutions in place?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I will say, while we do have a very strong emphasis on direct payments, especially because our goal is to make nature stewardship not just a cultural choice, but a financially feasible choice too. We see one of the biggest pressures and reasons why we're seeing biodiversity collapse, especially on community lands, is because people just simply can't earn a decent living from it. And so they decide to convert into something else. And so a big focus for us is embedding unit economics into the cultural fabrics that are so regenerative for the world and making them resilient. But we also, just to be clear, we don't advocate for all the money to go as direct payments, right? Definitely a certain percentage should and can go for community benefit, because really what our whole design principle is group management, right? Communal management. That is what's essential for all of this nature. That's why all this nature is on community lands, because of that group management. In the case of, let's say, Maasai communities in Kenya, moving your cattle over large areas, which in turn keeps the land open for wildlife, but direct agency as well. So you need a combination of both, in our belief, to have long-term nature stewardship. So I think that's one thing I just want to be clear. But that even within the group benefit situation, how do you have individuals within that community be able to participate, either upvoting, downvoting, and have traceability and insight into how that money was spent? And so this is a way of answering your question, that sort of the key point here is, how are you able to engage and onboard at the individual or household level and organize that information within, like, handling all the complexity of a community structure, right? Once you do that, now the payment delivery, right, is just, there's actually a lot of existing solutions for payment execution, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in Kenya, you have mobile wallets, mobile money. People don't have bank accounts, but they have a SIM card and they can receive mobile money. This is increasingly the case in a lot of different places. Even in some cases, we handle checks, cash. The point, the RTGS or bank transfer, these are all different forms of payment execution, of which there's been a lot of innovation, and there are a lot of different solutions out there. For us, the focus is, how do you know who to pay, how much to pay, and how do you verify that payment and to build trust? So that's a big focus for us. And ensure you're doing that within the integrity of the community structure.
Let's talk a bit about monetizing biodiversity, Viraj. How is the price of biodiversity set? This is always a point of challenge in carbon markets. How do they do it in biodiversity markets?
Yeah, so it really depends on what kind of market you're talking about within a biodiversity market. So there are compliance-based markets, and then there are voluntary markets. So for example, I just returned back from a trip to Colombia, where I was visiting, some of the work done by an amazing company called Terrasos over there. Listeners on your podcast should definitely give them a look. But there are compliance laws. So any company that impacts nature, biodiversity, impacts the land, right? Let's think of an infrastructure company, mining company, for example. First, they have to, they have to restore, let's say they're mining on 1,000 acres, they got to restore that. But they also have to pay to protect an area of ecological equivalence, right? Sometimes at an impact multiplier, like let's say depending on the ecosystem. So if I'm mining on, 1,000 acres of forest, I have to protect 6,000 acres of forest. And so there, a lot of the pricing, there's a lot of factors from a regulatory perspective that come into play on that side. Perhaps what you're referring to is on the voluntary side around payments for nature outcomes, but primarily from a voluntary perspective, as in no compliance yet in place or regulations yet in place. There, really how, certainly from the transactions that we've been able to execute on this side, a lot of this comes down again to our platform, which able to give insights at an acre level. What is the value? Like how much is a landowner currently receiving from nature today, right? Sometimes they get a little bit of money from an ecotourism operator, for example, let's say $30 a year.
Mm-hmm.
How much could they get if they were to convert that acre into the likely opportunity cost, right? The likely alternative land use option, typically putting a fence around it intensively, putting a bunch of pesticides, fertilizers, growing wheat or corn or maize, maybe sand harvesting, quarrying. And you typically, and so a lot of the landscapes that we're working on, that can be at about like $100 an acre. And so it becomes a very clear pricing mechanism for a funder to be able to see, and a buyer to be able to see, my goal is to sustain this landscape. We need to try and make nature stewardship a financially feasible choice. So how do we bridge that financing gap? And the platform allows for that comparison at an acre level.
Yeah, okay. So a follow-up question on that is, whenever we have a market-based solution for things like biodiversity, the emphasis on community turns to be compliance rather than true stewardship. That happens in many parts of the world. They work on passing the audits rather than the genuine stewardship that for generations they have maintained. Do you see this tension in the communities you work with?
So sorry. So to understand your question, you're saying that nature stewardship then becomes a checkbox exercise versus a cultural thing. Is that
Precisely? Yes, the communities rush to comply in order to get that financial incentive, rather than integrating it as part of their lives, which you talked about in some of your previous answers. Do you see that tension at all among the communities you operate?
So currently, that nature financing gap at that microeconomic level, at that individual level of a community is so significant that right now, really, it's just about how do you make these cultures resilient? Because what's happening, Senthil, is that because a given landowner can make so little from nature and a lot more if they were to do something else, right? Increasingly, people are just choosing to do that something else. And you're seeing an erosion in the cultural fabric, right? And actually, because that something else, let's say wheat farming in the middle of a savanna, is actually largely incompatible with the land use of that area. These are dry, arid areas. So you find that landowner says, okay, I got to pay the bills. So I got to switch to something that will do it. So let me dig a well or a borehole, drain the water table, dump a bunch of pesticides, fertilizers. Remember, these are some of the most bio-rich areas, insects, birds, etc. I got to kill them all. That elephant that before used to move openly through my land with minimal resistance, right? Now suddenly the elephant is now a massive pest because it's breaking through my fence, coming to eat my crops, right? And so there's more human-wildlife conflict. And you can only do this for about 4, 5, 6 years before the land is so depleted. You got to either move on to the next bit of land or you just sell it for pennies on the dollar. And then what happens, Senthil, is as a landowner, you then end up moving into an urban slum and you've lost your tie to your area, your land, your culture, your people. So you see a lost resilience to climate change and ultimately an erosion of culture. And we have worked in some communities where very proud landowners now are the security guards to people who bought the land for pennies on the dollar and, now do like sand harvesting or quarrying or something. And they're just the security guard on what used to be their land. And Senthil, if we look at history, so I got to work for Native American tribes as well when I spent time in the US. And it's a similar story there. I used to work for a tribe where they used to own all of their land on their reservation, right? And then in 1885, there was an act called the Dawes Act, which subdivided the land into 80-acre titles, 80-acre allotments. And Senthil, within 2 decades of the passing of the Dawes Act, this tribe owned less than 3% of their land, right? Landers just sold it for pennies on the dollar. Fast forward 100 years later when I was working for them, right? They're now trying to buy back their land. And they're buying it at, like way, way more expensive prices. And they're having to, cut down their trees, et cetera, to be able to try and finance that. And so they're now at 15, 18%. So we're seeing these waves of subdivision happening across Africa, across Latin America, across Asia, right? Because landowners want agency, they need to pay the bills. And so they're saying, you know what, just give me forget this communal structure business, give me my 10 acres, 20 acres, 40 acres. At least I have more of an ability to make some money, right? But in this process, if not done correctly, so that you can continue to, that direct agency is so important, but if you need to be able to have that direct agency with that community structure, because if you lose that, then we see land loss and biodiversity collapse.
That's an excellent answer, Viraj. What are some of the institutions that are interested in investing behind biodiversity? Are they businesses, philanthropic organizations? Where do you see most interest?
Yeah, so it's honestly it runs the gamut. So obviously we've got philanthropy is certainly in these early days of the markets. Philanthropy is a very promising avenue. There's about $800 billion in global philanthropy. I believe it's something like less than 1 or 2% goes to nature today. And, one question that we're asking is, as you make nature much more people focused, so to bring it to community lands and much more outcomes based, can you start to draw in more capital into the system? Because as has been commonly cited, direct conditional payments for nature outcomes is genuinely amongst the most effective conservation strategies. There's a very rich body of evidence around this. And it speaks to all what we've talked about earlier. It's about how do you just make these cultures financially feasible, right? And so that is definitely one path. But increasingly, when we have transacted now across a number of different other industries, so if you think of companies that want to align with global frameworks like TNFD or the Global Biodiversity Framework, so companies that want to make statements around nature, you think of in particular infrastructure companies, mining companies, and increasingly data centers are a really promising customer segment.
And do you draw any lessons from the carbon markets? I think a lot of missteps that undermine trust in carbon credits and stuff. Do you draw any lessons from that space at all? Or they are
100%.
two different spaces?
100%. So carbon markets are absolutely an area where we learn a lot from, especially as it relates with communities, has been a really significant flow of finance in recent years to communities. One of the biggest pain points in the carbon markets is that when carbon finance goes to these community areas for carbon outcomes, in this case, carbon sequestration, typically the money, yes, it goes to the community, but it typically goes to a representative group, maybe a trust or a leadership group, who then decide what to do with that money, right? As alluded to earlier, some of that money goes maybe to build a school or well, but maybe the school is built by the chief's house. And the individuals within those communities rarely see the direct benefit of that project. And so then you see grievances being raised, you see a misalignment, right? People are like, how is this really benefiting me? And it's also much harder to have traceability on these financial flows. It's harder to show how this money was spent. And to your point on additionality, what is additional about this? And so this financial traceability as it relates to sophisticated financial flows, the reality is carbon markets this is not unique to carbon. This is the default flow for money when it comes to communities, right? Like this in Kenya, you have ecotourism as a major source of finance for communities. We're working in places where previously millions of dollars worth of money in theory is supposed to go to the community, and yet the individual community members rarely were paid directly. Only in very small instances has that really happened. And again, not in a very sophisticated way, because no tourist is going to say, where are you actually sending this money, right? Like it's they go and enjoy the land. But now as you start to move carbon markets, carbon finance is amongst the first times you're starting to get more sophisticated international flows of capital. And so the level of scrutiny is higher. And that's where you're seeing a lot of this negative publicity coming out around, is this money actually reinforcing past injustices, right? And running into issues on that side. And so a huge focus for EarthAcre is ensuring that financial traceability and ensuring, yes, group management, but direct agency and participation and benefit as well. And if you crack that, now you can start to flow a number of different revenues through that: ecotourism, carbon, nature assets, payment for ecosystem services, regulated markets, eventually debt for nature swaps, etc. But that we really believe that basic principle of digitizing, organizing the community structure forms the basis for a lot of this ability for communities to get paid for nature.
Interesting. One question before we move to the final section. Now, I understand you largely work in Kenya, is it correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so when you scale up globally, what is the single biggest risk you see?
Yeah, so even within Kenya, forget even scaling beyond the borders of Kenya, there are plenty of challenges, right? And so because the biggest thing is the trust element. Our whole focus is, if you can build safety and confidence, if you can build trust in the system, you can give all the constituents within this value chain the safety and confidence to deploy more into the system. Funders can deploy more, they have more safety and confidence, but crucially, the landowners themselves can also invest more in conservation. And probably one of the most important players in this value chain is what we call the project developer, which is the local organization. Sometimes it's the community leadership. Sometimes it's an external developer, let's say an ecotourism camp or a carbon developer. Sometimes it's a local NGO, local company, but it's an organization that typically has the relationships on the ground with the constituent community members. And so these organizations, what we call project developers, they have the relationships on the ground. As EarthAcre, all we do is help that project developer digitize their relationships. And so that even within Kenya, that is how we are scaling. For a very nominal license fee, we allow for project developers to effectively digitize their relationships with community members, reliably track livelihood, financial, and nature data, and in doing so, being able to draw new capital into the system because you're providing that safety and confidence to other nature-based funders across different pools of capital.
All right. Let's move to the final section. I call it as how I did it. I asked 3 questions to all my guests. How do you manage differences of opinion in your work?
Yeah, so much of what we do requires building a cross-cultural sensitivity and technology. And so our operational leadership team is built exactly in this vein. So my co-founder, Patita, She's Maasai. She grew up herding her cows across one of our pilot sites, actually knows that area like the back of her hand. And then, grew up, got a full ride at the University of Cambridge, and now represents Indigenous women at the national entity in Kenya, and is actually on the Council of Advisor on the advisory group for Vera, which is the global standard responsible for about 80% of carbon credits. It's one of the global standards for nature markets. And my other co-founder, Yasha, he's spent the past 15 years in technology leadership, both starting his own company in the US and then being the director of software engineering at Optaro, the company that I previously mentioned that had raised about $300 million on circular economies. And so we're when you bring in place other people like Professor Davies, a world leader in scientific measurements for nature, Mark, who's spent about 20 years at the intersection of finance and climate. Mohan Jidu was an early pioneer in community-based ecotourism. So we have a lot of different perspectives, and really my job is to bridge these worlds, because we genuinely believe that it's at the seams of expertise that there's so much opportunity, and we're going to need that in order to bridge these worlds and get landowners paid for nature.
One message you want to give to business leaders?
Going back to your earlier question, in order to manage across opinions, which I believe is so critical to bring new solutions and to forge a new way forward, you really need humility is key, right? If you get too attached to your own ideas, you may miss these chances to create this new path. And so I've personally benefited so much by having different skill sets, backgrounds on the team. It helps us pressure test things, fail them internally, so that we radically reduce the chance of them failing externally, for example. And of course, probably the biggest thing is having resilience. So achieving these kinds of missions is not easy. If it were, everybody would be doing it, but remembering that challenges are opportunities to lead, adapt, and show excellence when it matters most. And my co-founder Yasha has a good saying, like, never waste a good crisis. But probably the most important thing is ultimately to just enjoy the ride. Something I'm definitely doing much more of and trying to do much more of, because it's such a privilege to be able to get to do the thing that you love with the people that you love and on a mission you deeply care about. So really keeping that.
Lovely. One book you recommend to our listeners, or one book you keep reading again and again?
Yeah, I really like The Case for Nature by Viraj Sikand. So he argues that climate action isn't enough and that the world must also address nature loss if we want resilient economies and societies. And I think it does a really good job of profiling different case studies around the world. It's inspiring to see what other founders and organizations are doing in this messy space of nature and business and technology. And actually EarthAcre was included in the technology chapter. So that was great.
That's lovely. Okay, I'll leave a link to the book. Viraj, what a pleasure talking to you today. And it's very refreshing to hear such innovative ideas happening in some of the most needed communities in the world. So thank you so much for your time and joining me today and sharing all these very interesting, forward-looking perspectives.
Great. Yeah, it was a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Lovely. Listeners, thanks so much for joining me today. That was Viraj Sikand, CEO of EarthAcre, talking about nature markets, his work at EarthAcre as the chief executive. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share it with anyone who's interested in the intersection of business and purpose. Thanks so much for joining today.